Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be racking and bottling this dark cherry hard cider. So we are going to need a vessel for it to go into, for it to rest for a while, age out a little bit. We're also going to need a hydrometer and a graduated cylinder for taking a gravity reading. So we're going to start with taking that reading. Graduated cylinder, this is a glass hydrometer. Now that we have our sample, we're going to take a quick reading, give it a spin to break any bubbles loose so it's floating on its own. And this came out to a 0.998. This is extremely dry. So these yeast absolutely went to town here. Take a quick note of that. The current day and what the gravity reading was. And then we will rack this into the other carboy and we'll let it sit for a little bit. Let it clear out a little bit more. To do that, the receiving carboy needs to be lower. We are going to dump the sample back in after. We're just going to get everything racked real quick. So the receiving carboy is going to go down low so gravity can do its work. And the auto siphon is going to get us started here. Go about halfway down to start so you don't disrupt the lease at the bottom. Any of that sediment and those cherries floating around there, let those continue to sit so they don't get sucked up. And then we're just going to rack it into this vessel. You can see we have very little headspace here, which is good. You don't want any excess amount of oxygen in the vessel after it is done fermenting. That is asking for trouble, specifically with creating vinegar, especially at a lower ABV like this, which I believe this came out to about 6.5%. But we are going to pull a little extra out of there just to take a sample once we're done here. So now all we need is a glass for a sample and a bung with a cleaned airlock. That is Star San in that airlock, Star San and water mixed to manufacturer's recommendation. It's also what I use to clean all this equipment. And now we're going to take a sample. This came out extremely dry and not super good. There is a little bit of cherry flavor, a little bit of apple flavor. It is young. So this is the next day. We are actually going to re-rack it back into the wide mouth, and we're going to let it rest on some more cherries for a little bit to get a little bit of extra flavor in there. This is just really boring. That is 1 extra pound of cherries that I did cut up a little bit. I'm using an actual fermenting bag to make cleanup a lot easier. So we're just going to tie that off, and then we are going to rack that cider back into the wide mouth fermenter. And we're going to let this sit for a while. And as per usual, you got to make a mess. It's just required. And because this hasn't been sitting long enough for any sediment to settle out, you can just drop the auto siphon all the way to the bottom and let that do its thing. And now this is going to sit. I'll be right back with the re-racking and bottling, but this is going to sit for, I think I let it sit for about 2 weeks on those cherries. All right, it has been about 2 weeks. This has been resting with those cherries. So now we are going to once again rack it, and then we are going to add some priming sugar, and probably going to need a little bit of yeast, but we'll see. And then we are going to bottle and naturally carbonate these. So to get started, we are just going to pull those cherries out, let them sit in that colander. Again, all of this has been sanitized in Star San mixed with water. This smells much better now. Resting on those cherries was definitely a good choice. It's brought a lot more fragrance to the brew, at least. Pull those out careful as to not disturb the sediment at the bottom. And those will sit a while, and whatever drains out will be added back. But for now, we're going to take a quick gravity reading. This is just to make sure if any sugars did come out of the cherries, it fermented off, but in this case it did not. So the whatever yeast is left in this is done, it's dormant or dead. So we are going to have to add a little extra priming yeast for natural carbonation in the bottle. I think we got 4 points out of this. We're going to take a quick sample here. This has cleared out a lot as well, which is nice. And then we're going to take the rest of that to add the yeast and sugar to. On the smell, there is much more cherry now, which makes sense. Still quite a bit of tartness. These are mostly black cherries, and apple is quite tart, especially when the sugar's been removed like this. But it is vastly improved from where it was before. There's quite a bit more cherry flavor, even without a ton of sugar in it. This is much better, and carbonation is going to make it even more so. This is some pre-warmed, just so that the sugar mixes in easier. We're going to add, because there is some sugar in it from the cherries, we are going to add 26 grams of sugar. Normally I do 28, but this does still have some residual sugar in it, so we don't need all of it. So we're going to do 26 grams, and then mix it into that cup of cider that has been warmed up. You can use white sugar, you can use brown sugar, you can use honey for this. Just you want the same amount of sugar as if you were adding 1 ounce or 28 grams of sugar. You can even add fruit juice if you wanted to, but that will change your gravity reading as you are diluting it. And warming this up just makes it so that sugar mixes in considerably easier. Otherwise you're going to end up with grains of sugar at the bottom that didn't fully mix in. And it mixed in quite quickly, being warm like this, so it doesn't take much. Checking for errant sugar. Mix a little bit longer than you think you need to. I'm pretty sure I'm done at this point, but I'm going to keep mixing just to make sure it is fully incorporated. And then we are going to add probably 1/8 of a packet of yeast, just to make sure there is living yeast in the brew so that it will ferment and create that carbonation in the bottle. This is a neutral yeast. It's a yeast with very little in the way of esters, so it doesn't affect the flavor, and it has a higher alcohol tolerance than the yeast that we used to brew it initially. It's actually a white wine yeast, I believe. But we're just going to rack this quick. And we are back. I re-racked it into the wide mouth so that I could more easily mix it with the sugar and yeast. Once the mixture with the sugar cooled down, I added the yeast to it. But we're just going to pour that in carefully. And then we're going to mix that all in. Make sure it is well incorporated so that you get yeast and sugar in equal amounts in every bottle. And that is why I do it like this instead of trying to measure out the amount of sugar and yeast you would need for each individual bottle. This way you get an equal amount in every one. You don't end up with a bottle bomb or a bottle that doesn't carbonate at all. Now that I'm fairly certain that is incorporated completely, we are going to put the bottles on my stool here so that we can rack into them. I do have a bottling wand to prevent any sort of mess that would happen. That just stops the flow when you pick it up. It's got a spring and a valve at the bottom. You can see the black tip. That's your nozzle that's going to press into the bottom of the bottle and open up that valve. So we're just going to get this going here. And I ended up getting 8 bottles out of this, each one of them full enough for me to be comfortable with letting them ferment and carbonate in bottle. These are bottles that are rated for pressure. They are beer bottles. There is very little headspace in each one, so you're not going to end up with a ton of gas pressure inside. And these are going to go into a waterproof box for the next week or so to carbonate. If you follow along, let me know how it turns out, and if there's anything you want to see, let me know. Thank you.